Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we're taking a look at the theology of Søren Kierkegaard with Simon Podmore. So Dr. Simon Podmore, is professor of theology at Liverpool Hope University. He's the author of several books, including Struggling with God, Kierkegaard and the Temptation of Spiritual Trial, and Kierkegaard and the Self Before God, Anatomy of the Abyss. Dr. Podmore, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All righty. So, I've been interested in Kierkegaard for years and years, never read that much of him, but I'm interested in his theology. So, but if you could start with just a little of your personal background, where you're coming from theologically and your church background, and then why you're interested in Kierkegaard.
Thank you. Well, interestingly, those questions are intertwined. I was brought up in an atheist, agnostic household, but I always felt a sort of connection or some sort of consciousness of the divine, whatever it was, something that was beckoning me forward. But I was also aware that there was this vast abyss between us. And these were ideas that I later, discovered in Kierkegaard. So my journey in that respect was unusual. I eventually found the church and was baptized into the Church of England when I was a teenager. But I always felt a little bit one foot in, one foot out. And that's in relation to the church rather than to Christianity per se. And again, I found a lot of these ideas resonant in Kierkegaard. Sorry, now I said Kierkegaard rather than Kierkegaard. Now, this is because as part of my PhD, I had to learn to read Danish. And in the world of Kierkegaard, people tend to slip into the Danish pronunciation. But as I say to my students, Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard, it doesn't matter. So apologies if I slip
I'm
one way.
fine either way.
Okay. Um, One of the things that struck me when I joined the church was I was expecting people who were very, very serious about, about following Christ, not necessarily succeeding in it, but that would, that had a strong existential, spiritual interest in their religion. And I found that for a lot of people that wasn't the case. And very much this idea of go to church on Sunday, everything else is just up to us and we'll just live our lives however we want. And I found very much that Kierkegaard had a similar experience. So Kierkegaard was frustrated about this idea that one was born a Christian just because one was born Danish or English or whatever, but in his case, Danish. And so he felt that the Danish church wasn't always taking Christianity seriously enough and wasn't quite aware of just how radical it really was and just how much of an infinite qualitative difference, his key phrase, there is between the human and the divine. And so if we imagine that our lives are, pretty much commensurate with just living a capitalist life and just going to church on a Sunday, that these things are just meshed together completely, then we're deluding ourselves and we're also in many ways betraying what Christ set out to do. So my relationship with the church has been sometimes difficult and challenging, and but I found Kierkegaard actually helped me an awful lot to find a place and to be content with a slightly liminal position, to be realize, okay, maybe I am a bit in and a bit out, but that's okay. And Kierkegaard, reading Kierkegaard feeling, very much the same, and also berating the church of his time as a result of it. I found this really fascinating. And so I was drawn to Kierkegaard partly because of that, because of his challenging relationship with the church. Also because he was concerned with um, profound but often dark ideas such as despair, anxiety, and melancholy, but that he took seriously um, the infinite difference between us and God, but also the sort of human longing, the human profound longing and struggle to return to God, to return to our home. And as far as I saw from my undergraduate, Kierkegaard was asking questions that else was asking, and he was creating a style of theology that I hadn't seen before, which was a style of theology that was able to use literary techniques, was able to use examples from art and culture, was able to experiment with ideas, and wasn't afraid to leave certain issues open and undecided. So in many ways, he's not that systematic, but he is, I think, consistent with a lot of his ideas.
Okay, but as far as you though, have you always been Church of England then?
Yes, more or less, more or less.
Okay, okay, okay. Well, that's good to know then. All right, so how about some background to Kierkegaard's life? What sort of experiences did he have? His career, his relationship with his father, his fiance, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, with Kierkegaard, in many ways, he doesn't do an awful lot. He doesn't really go very far out, beyond Copenhagen. But he lives this very, very complex interior history. And to understand that, as you suggest, we have to go back really to his father. Now, Soren Kierkegaard and his father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, seem to have had this quite intimate relationship. There seems to be a kind of recognition between this father and this son that they are very much of the same type of mentality. I mean, Kierkegaard had a number of other brothers and sisters, but his father seemed to really feel this connection with him. But Soren was very aware that his father was a brooding, melancholy, seemingly quite troubled man. And there's all sorts of suggestions and illusions scattered throughout Kierkegaard's writings, throughout his personal private journals as well. And Kierkegaard scholars spent a lot of time trying to decipher what exactly, went on between them and what exactly, his father's issue was. I mean, but one of the themes that comes out is this sense that Kierkegaard's father, Michael, grew up in quite a poor rural part of Denmark, Jutland, and so according to one theory, he was out tending sheep as a boy, and he cursed God for the hardship and the poverty that he was enduring. And in some sense, he felt that he was never able to escape this, that, this was always following him throughout his life. And that Soren was to be the inheritor of this melancholy and of this curse that would hang over the family. And I think a lot of what Soren does in some of his writings is to try and deal with that, with try and address that in indirect ways and try to free himself of it, try to free himself of this sense of a God who is vengeful, punishing, and essentially opposes him and haunts the family. And Kierkegaard engages this with this alternative view of God, which is a God of love, a God who is a God of love, regardless of how things may appear to us. And that's the real one certainty that he's always trying to hold on to, is to hold on to the God of love in the face of of suffering, and in the face of struggle. Um, so um, Now, Kierkegaard's father, although he's born in poverty, he manages to move up a class, as it were, and then move into cosmopolitan Copenhagen, where he is a hosier, so selling socks and tights and things like that, and manages to, accrue a fair amount of money, manages to do pretty well, to the extent to which Soren doesn't really have to do an awful lot to earn money himself. He's able to kind of lounge around and spend his father's inheritance and, um, excuse me, and these sorts of things. But actually, it's while he was an aesthete as a young man, someone who enjoyed the pursuit of pleasure as well as spiritual pursuits. It was really when his father died that he was really shaken up and realized that he had to take things like seriously, he had to take his life seriously, and he had to discover, as he said, that one thing that I would be willing to live or die for, this one truth, which for him ultimately was Christ, was God. Um, but in his works, he's trying to um, find ways um, to explore and deepen this relationship. So he writes a number of different types of books. So he decides this is his career, to be a writer. And of course, there's quite a luxurious career to have in the 19th century, although he suffered quite a lot of, poor health, and he died, very, very young, at only the age of 42. And he left behind him numerous books, books which, some of which were written under pseudonyms, some of which were written under his own name, some of which were very philosophical, some of which were very theological, even devotional. And Kierkegaard would use pseudonyms as ways of experimenting with ideas that he didn't necessarily himself agree with. So sometimes he's used a pseudonym as a way of satirizing a particular position, like he might do with a Hegelian position, because in his day in Denmark, Hegel was all the rage, and every theologian seemed to be a Hegelian and believed that Hegel had the key to the future of theology, which we might return to at some point. So Kierkegaard would use these pseudonyms, sometimes to present positions that didn't represent him, but sometimes to represent positions that he aspired to. So, in probably my favorite of Kierkegaard's book, The Sickness Unto Death, this is written under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, which means the one who is higher than one of Kierkegaard's other pseudonyms, Johannes Climacus, John the Climber. So Anticlimacus represents this higher form of Christian, a Christian that Kierkegaard himself aspired to be, but didn't really feel that he had the authority to speak from. He hadn't acquired that position, and he referred to himself as an author without authority, someone who, from himself, he has no authority. He's really trying to speak to the reader as the single individual. So he's trying to address the reader as a single individual and to, as he sometimes put it, to deceive the reader into the truth.
Hmm.
So many of his books, one way or the other, they're concerned with actually trying to elicit the importance of the God relationship, the importance of Christianity, and sometimes in ways that the reader might not quite realize are taking place. So there's these indirect ways of doing it, but also he wanted his books to be read in the same way actually he read the Bible, which was as a mirror. So he says when you open these books, you should have these moments where you recognize yourself within the pages. And that's very much was my experience with Kierkegaard. Um, was sometimes recognizing myself within sometimes the characters that he would sketch out or some of the positions that he would show. And a lot of that was based on his own experience, that he had felt and experienced lots of different positions, sometimes, real dissonance in terms of how he would think about God, sometimes in one way and sometimes in another way.
Right.
But the point of reading for Kierkegaard was that when we look into these books, they should act as mirrors that reflect us back to ourselves, that we should recognize ourselves within them. And likewise, that's how the Bible should be read. So
Okay, so what did he actually make a living at writing, or was he still just living off his father's money?
he managed to make some money. I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly how much, but without his father's money, I think he would have struggled. He probably wouldn't have been able to make a living as a writer, even though he did produce a lot of books and he was, always published. And if he'd lived longer, he certainly would have seen more in the way of royalties. But he did rely on the family
Okay, did
wealth.
he do other jobs besides writing?
Not really, not that I'm aware of.
But now
What
his
the
father actually had wanted him to be a pastor, a minister, right? So he did consider that, right?
Oh, he did. No, that's true. And he did actually train for the ministry. He studied theology at Copenhagen University, and in that sense was training for it, but didn't follow through on it. And he always was felt that this role of being a pastor was something that, in a sense, he might have had it, but he might have lived in another life. That it was something that he would have loved to have done. And at times in his journals, he says, maybe this is my moment now where, God wants me to go off and be a country pastor out somewhere, and live a more comfortable life. But he was also a polemicist and he felt that he needed to um, attack quite a lot of falsehood. Couldn't tolerate falsity and self-deception, and as such, he devoted himself to, in many ways, attacking what he saw as untruth.
It would be hard to be a pastor and carry on that prophetic role as well.
Yeah, and I think prophetic is the right thing because it's that sense of speaking truth to power. And that's exactly what he wanted to do, and exactly what he felt that many of the ministers, including particularly the bishops, were utterly failing to do. That they were presenting a state Danish Lutheran church that was utterly commensurate with New Testament Christianity, that was, of one of a piece with Christ. And Kierkegaard found that increasingly unbearable to the point at which later in his life, towards the end of his life, he undertook what became known as the attack upon Christendom. And he distinguishes Christendom, the idea of a Christian kingdom, the idea of Europe as a Christian kingdom. He distinguished that from Christianity. So for him, Christendom was this nationalistic delusion that Christianity and your national identity are inherently one and the same. That one is just born a Christian, and as I said previously, you don't have to do much else other than go to church on a Sunday. And he even called this a betrayal of Christianity and a betrayal of Christ, essentially. So for Kierkegaard, his writings were trying to revive what he saw as true Christianity, And so he got very, very involved in this attack on the church towards the end of his life, to the point at which even members of his own family were apologizing to the church, particularly after he attacked one of the bishops, Bishop Munster. And even at his funeral, Kierkegaard, on his deathbed, had refused to take communion from anyone other than a lay person. And after his death, the state church announced, what a wonderful person Kierkegaard had been, and what a great witness to the truth he had been. Except, maybe he'd lost his way a little bit, but ultimately, he was on our side, which he obviously would have hated. And one of his, I think, if I remember rightly, one of his nephews steps forward during his funeral service and basically says to everybody, "This is outrageous. You all know that Soren, he would have hated this. This is nothing. You're trying to kind of um, wipe away your own sins by saying he was always one of ours." So that and a lot of scholars as well historically have not taken the attack upon Christendom seriously. Some have suggested that Kierkegaard was becoming mentally unstable towards the end of his life, or that there was some kind of illness that was causing him to act in this way. But I actually, reading Kierkegaard's works from early to late, I actually don't see them as inconsistent whatsoever. I see the attack upon Christendom as utterly in continuity with
Sure.
what had gone before. And
Okay.
particularly, sorry, Dennis.
Let go back to the so the relationship. He had a relationship with a woman, and how did that turn out, and how did that affect his life and his thought?
Yeah, along with his father, I mean, that's the other sort of key biographical relationship in many ways. And this was with a young lady called Regina Olsen, who Kierkegaard fell very deeply in love with, and eventually proposed to her, so became engaged. But over time, began to think that perhaps his relationship with God and his relationship with Regina were incompatible, meaning that he wanted to follow whatever he felt God was telling him to do. And that might mean going into territory that he didn't want to take Regina into. He also felt that if he were to marry her, he would have to be 100% honest with her, honest about his own, what he called his melancholy or his depression, or his own, nature as a human being, his warts and all, and also something about whatever had been passed down from his father, some deep family secret or whatever. But he said, I would have to initiate her into everything. And ultimately, I don't want to do that to her. And also because he felt that at that time, anyway, his relationship with God was quite traumatic at times. And again, he felt that he didn't want to involve her in that. He didn't want to involve her in the type of life of suffering that he felt that he was living and that he was meant to live, according to God. And so he broke off the relationship, which was scandalous in the 19th century Copenhagen high society, as it were. And so he would, sometimes see her in church, but he tried to soften the blow. So this is a good example of how his life and his works intersect. So he wanted to make Regina hate him, make her resent him, so that it would be easier for her to break with him and let him go. So one of the ways that he did this was to try and put it out there, go. Copenhagen was like most cities, a city of gossip. So he wanted to put it out there that he was a kind of a young seducer, that he was, more interested in wine and women and poetry and the theatre than anything else, and that he never really cared about her anyway. And part of the way he did this was by producing works which would have characters in them who were decadent seducer characters. And he would also um, he would famously he lived quite close to the theatre, and he adored the theatre, but actually he would be in his home and he'd be writing. He wrote and worked very, very hard. And at the time when he knew that the interval of whatever play was on was taking place, he would leave his home, hurry down to the theatre, and start hanging around the foyer, wander around the foyer, and maybe have a drink or something, so that everyone in Copenhagen would say, "Ah, we saw Soren at the theatre again last night. He's always there. He never does anything else." Sometimes he wouldn't go to church, but he would sit in the cafe opposite the church, so that everyone could see him as they came out of church. They could see that he hadn't gone. So he tried to make it easier for her to break with him. But ultimately, he totally underestimated her. And there's some very interesting research that's been conducted recently to look more deeply at this relationship and look more deeply at Regina. But it seems quite clear that she knew him far better than he gave her credit for, and perhaps loved him more than he gave her credit for. And she, in a sense, understood and forgave him. Um, she ended up marrying somebody else, but there's perhaps senses that her heart always belonged to Kierkegaard, and his certainly belonged to hers. And he left, everything was left to hers pretty much after he died. So you have this broken um, engagement, this sort of doomed, fatal love affair, tragic love affair, and then you have this melancholic relationship with the father, and these all sort of feed into the texts in various ways, some ways which are quite hidden, some ways which are a bit more obvious. And if you read Kierkegaard's journals as well, you learn a bit more about what he was thinking when he was writing a particular book. And that this book was intended to scare off Regina, but as I say, she saw through it. And if he had given her the credit that she deserved, then maybe things would have been quite different for him. I think ultimately he regretted it. And ultimately, I think he never quite forgave himself for his own loneliness.
So was he mostly just punishing himself, you think, by breaking with her?
I think that's partly it. I think that's partly that he felt that, he needed punishment, that God was going to punish him one way or another because of whatever he had done or whatever his father had done. And he felt ultimately, I think he felt that he didn't deserve her. But that's why this, he was still a young man when this happened. And it was, later that, when his after his father had died, he became more serious about life and decided to existentially pull himself up by the bootstraps and try and find a reason for living, to find that truth that he would live and die for.
Okay, so let's move on to Kierkegaard's thought on the individual before God. So, what is God's attitude towards humanity?
Okay, well, as I said, I mean, his books are sometimes dedicated to the single individual. And actually, sometimes that was code for Regina herself, but it also reflects the fact that the individual was Kierkegaard's prime concern, and that really is due to his partly due to his Lutheran heritage. Kierkegaard is a Lutheran thinker. Theologically, he's very Lutheran, though not entirely. There are certainly elements that are more commensurate with Catholicism as well. But his idea about the relationship between the individual and God is Lutheran through and through, meaning that there's this sense that what matters above all is that you will stand alone before God, alone before the face of God. And that sounds like ominous judgment, and that is one element of it. But it represents the fact that the relationship with God is one that can only be lived and understood subjectively. Right? We cannot, for Kierkegaard, we cannot have objective understanding of the objective truth of God. Right? Only God knows that, and Hegel, but we'll get to that at some point, I think. So the individual obviously is a very modern concern. So in many ways, Kierkegaard is a modern thinker. He's interested in these modern ideas such as the self, the question of self-consciousness, and also the question of um, freedom and autonomy and responsibility, very Enlightenment ideals. But he also was concerned with how these modern ideals can work with Christianity. And in some ways, Christianity challenged them. In some ways, Christianity would transform these ideas. So, you often hear Kierkegaard referred to as the father of existentialism. And in many ways, he is. But if that's the case, then you have to go back before Kierkegaard to Luther. You even go back all the way, arguably to Augustine, because Augustine develops this whole question, this whole notion of autobiography and the self's longing for the divine. Um, but the individual is always juxtaposed with the crowd. So for Kierkegaard, one of the worst sins of modernity was the way in which it could generate a crowd, right? You can whip up a crowd, particularly when it's concerned with, nationalistic ideals or even occasionally religious ideals. But the crowd for Kierkegaard was, as he called it, the crowd is untruth. The crowd, if you're in the crowd, you're not an individual. You've been swallowed up by the crowd, and likelihood is you will end up doing and saying what the rest of the crowd is saying. Okay, it's something mimetic about that relationship. But the crowd for Kierkegaard is also the crowd that crucified Jesus, right? The crowd that says crucify him, crucify him. So the crowd represents untruth, right? Those who know not what they do. So Kierkegaard always wants to extract the individual from the crowd and address them as an individual. And even in his writings, he's trying to reach individuals, people at a personal, individual level. Excuse me. And when it comes to God, of course, for Kierkegaard, God wants each human being to become who they are destined to become the self that we are meant to be. So God has a concern with each individual and with each individual fulfilling, their potential and living the life that is right for them. And God does not see humanity as an amorphous crowd. But at the same time, Kierkegaard takes seriously, very seriously, the whole question of sin and this infinite qualitative abyss between us and God. And it's an abyss that evokes, anxiety, melancholy, despair, and it's an abyss that try as much as we might, we cannot cross ourselves. Only Christ has crossed the abyss for us. And so it is only by faith in Christ that we are able to, in a sense, overcome the alienation of this infinite difference between us and God.
Okay. So, how about God's attitude towards humanity then?
Well, as I said, on the one hand, Kierkegaard wants to remind people of something that, in his view, Christianity has allowed to evaporate, which is to take seriously this idea that human beings are sinful and that this sin prevents us from having an authentic relationship with God. So on the one hand, God sees us as sinners, and we have to take that seriously. But on the other hand, and this is where Kierkegaard again is very Lutheran in his theology, um, we have to realize that ultimately God sees us as beloved children. God wishes to redeem us, and this personal relationship with God is one that is, while there's a lot of estrangement and alienation between us and God, ultimately the intimacy between self and God is such that Kierkegaard describes it as resting transparently in God or grounded transparently in God.
Hmm.
So this sense of going back to Augustine again, Augustine saying our hearts are restless until they rest in you, God. And I think Kierkegaard very much follows that same sort of motto. Um, so the difficulty though is how do you hold these two ideas together? On the one hand, the idea that we are sinners, that we are alienated and estranged from God. On the other hand, that God is love, that God loves each one of us individually, knows us better than ourselves. And the task is ultimately to come to see ourselves as God sees us, not to see ourselves as we see ourselves. So he says, you know, this whole idea about know thyself, knowing yourself is very important, very much a kind of modern fixation, but something Kierkegaard says should be taken seriously. However, he says that, you know, when you're just trying to reflect internally on yourself, you are limited. Even if you're trying to talk to other human beings about it, you're limited as to what you can know. The true self-knowledge is impossible, he says, without knowing God, or probably more accurately, without being known by God, if that makes sense.
Okay. And so you mentioned Hegel a couple times, how prominent he was, and I'm not too keen on Hegel myself, whatever I read about him in terms of his religion, his theology. But Kierkegaard obviously had big issues with him. So, what is his critique of Hegel, and what was the basics of Hegel's thought and his influence?
Well, I won't be able to cover all of that, but um, if we think about what it is about Hegel that bothered Kierkegaard, so Hegel had developed this, you know, grand system, and essentially he'd come to the point at which he saw that human history was also divine history, that the history of the world was the history of God's kenosis, God's pouring God's self into creation in the incarnation of Christ, but also as spirit in everything and everyone. So he saw history as advancing, progressing in line with religion to a point. He saw religion as useful and Christianity as the highest religion because Christianity had realized that the divine and the human must be brought together as one. So that's why Hegel says they're the highest, right? And that's something that we'll come back to, I think, if we've got time. Um, but Hegel, so Hegel wants to say that Christianity is the highest possible religion, but there's something beyond Christianity. And this is what he calls absolute knowing, or essentially philosophy. So beyond Christianity is philosophy. So philosophy as absolute knowing, which he basically says is theology, but on a higher level, um, is being able to know the mind of God, essentially, to see things as God sees them. And Kierkegaard thought this was ridiculous because, for one, there is this infinite qualitative abyss between us and God. And there is no way that we, through our own effort, particularly by relying on our reason, are able to cross this abyss, or that we are able to come to know things as God knows them. So that's why I said earlier, he says we cannot have an objective knowledge of the objective truth. We can only have a subjective relationship with that truth. So he believes that there is objective truth, he believes in God, but he thinks there's only so much that we as subjective human beings can accommodate and can cope with. And he sees Hegel and Hegel's followers as utterly violating this infinite difference between the human and the divine. And now some scholars point out that Kierkegaard's problem with Hegel has got more to do with actually the Hegelians of the time, the Danish Hegelian theologians who in Denmark at the time, many of whom thought that Hegel is the future for Christian theology. Hegel's got it sorted. Hegel is going to give us a way to kind of survive this the growing secularization of the Enlightenment and the threat of philosophy. So Hegel, a kind of Christian interpretation of Hegel, though I don't know whether such thing is really possible. But anyway, they thought that it was possible to marry Hegel and Christianity. And so most academic theologians were Hegelians. And it was more them that Kierkegaard was directing his criticism towards. And this involved, I suppose, trying to demonstrate. Sometimes he would satirize Hegel's thinking. Sometimes he would want to point out where Hegel had got things, along the right tracks, but there were certain flaws to what he was saying. But it was really the fashion of Hegelian philosophy and theology that Kierkegaard was trying to critique.
But for Hegel, it was also that, I mean, the state of Prussia, that his idea of the kingdom of God. So, I mean, it was really super inflated idea, and he saw himself as the greatest thinker. In his mind, in his philosophy, he'd come up with the ultimate. So can you say more about that?
Do you mean about the political dimensions of that, or?
Yeah, I mean, wasn't Kierkegaard concerned with that also, as well as just the theology?
Oh, yes. I mean, yeah, he was concerned with there was a sort of a growth of Danish nationalism at the time. And this was seen you can still see the after effects of it today, the sort of celebration of Danish writers such as Hans Christian Andersen, the Brothers Grimm and sort of Danish fairy tale folklore tradition, but also that Danish nationalism was also hand in hand with Christianity. And one of the things that Kierkegaard pointed out was that the whole idea of nationalism was itself a modern invention, a modern construct. And Danish thinkers were actually importing it from Russia, Germany. So it was an import anyway. So it wasn't indigenous to Denmark. If Denmark wanted to celebrate its national identity. It should do it in a different way. It should do it in its own distinctive way. Um, and of course, one of the dangers also with Hegel's thinking is that he believed that Geist, spirit or mind, as it's sometimes, but essentially the divine mind, um, was sometimes realized in certain individuals more than others. So certain individuals would, I suppose, epitomize and exemplify the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. So Hegel, for example, talked about Napoleon, how Napoleon, this great, triumphant emperor, that he represented, a height of spirit. And if this is supposed to be, divine spirit, and it's supposed to be celebrated through someone like Napoleon, then you've got this very, very dangerous marriage of politics and Christianity that Kierkegaard, didn't want to see take any further hold in Denmark.
Okay, and what did Kierkegaard mean by his understanding of truth as subjectivity? You already talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, so he now sometimes people misinterpret Kierkegaard, and we have this with our students as well sometimes, and think that when Kierkegaard says truth is subjectivity, he's saying that whatever it is that you think is true subjectively, that is true for you, and that's great. And everyone just has their own subjective truth. Now, he might think that, yes, people do have their own subjective truths, but the important point is that there is objective truth, there is absolute truth. And in fact, discovering the absolute truth and relating to that truth is probably the most important task for a human being. But the truth is such that we can never have a full rational understanding of it, right? Unless our brains are as large as Hegel's, right? Who can clearly sustain all of this. We can only relate to it in a subjective way. And also because the relationship to the truth is not just about reason, that Kierkegaard sees the human being in a more holistic way as also a passionate being, a being of the heart as well as the head, right? An emotional, affective being, and one who needs to relate, as in be in relationship with the truth rather than know the truth objectively. So that's why he talks about Christ as the truth incarnate. So in Christ, the truth is not a set of teachings to be passed down. The truth is a human being who is simultaneously fully divine and fully human. So the truth is this shocking paradox. Okay, so and this is actually another place where if we want to think about Kierkegaard's Christology and his idea of the Incarnation, again, this is something relevant to his critique of Hegel, because, excuse me, whereas Hegel was concerned with how do the human and the divine come together? How do opposites like the finite and the infinite come together? And for Hegel, Christ is the perfect synthesis of the human and the divine. And of course, he would use the term Aufhebung, a sublation, something that brings the two up into a higher unity. So Hegel saw Christ as, in a sense, a perfectly rational coming together of the human and the divine. And Kierkegaard thought this was absurd, because how on earth could we manage to fully understand, fully comprehend the Incarnation? How could we overcome the fact that the Incarnation is offensive? He says it's offensive, firstly, to reason, because we have this idea of a person who is fully divine and fully human, and according to purely formal logic, that doesn't make sense. So for him, for Kierkegaard, Christ is the paradox. Okay, so something that is true even though it doesn't make sense. Okay, so on what level is it true? Well, it's true on a more redemptive, salvific, and existential level. So Hegel saw this as a way coming together. Kierkegaard says, no, it's a paradox. And as a paradox, it's a stumbling block. So sort of following the writings of Paul in this respect, Christ as an offense, a stumbling block. And Christ is also, he says, offensive because Christ claims to be here to save us. Christ is claiming to forgive sins. And, some people will say, well, I don't think I've done anything that bad that I need to be saved, or I don't really think my sins need to be forgiven. They've already been forgiven. So there's all sorts of reasons why we might be offended by Christ. And he also says that um, this whole question of history, which is so important for Hegel, that history is also divine history. Um, this was a real question. This was a real, theological hot topic, and actually a bit of a theological crisis, particularly in Germany in the Enlightenment period. And this was the emergence of historical critical methods applied to biblical scholarship. So previously, scholars had applied these methods to, classical texts, and then they were being applied. Someone thought, okay, let's apply them to the Bible. Let's treat the biblical texts, especially the Gospels, as if they were historical documents and see how historically reliable they are. And this was taken up by people like Reimarus and then most notoriously by Strauss, because whereas Reimarus and others were a little bit cagey about their findings and about whether to even publish in their own lifetime, Strauss was able to, openly and defiantly out himself as an atheist. And, he writes this book about the life of Jesus critically examined, meaning taking a critical historical eye to the Gospels. And in this book, he, attacks Christianity for trying to base itself on this historical document that really cannot be treated as a historical document. And this whole method of scholarship, this whole new approach to considering the Bible, caused huge waves, across Europe, eventually reaching England and of course in America as well. But Kierkegaard thought it was based on a fundamental mistake, and that is that he says that Christianity isn't about saying if only we knew enough about the historical details, then we could make an informed decision. Then we could have faith. We could overcome this, great ditch between, 2,000 years ago and, the 19th century or even the 21st century. And Kierkegaard says, to be honest, it probably would have made no difference if I had lived in the first century Palestine, and even if I had been a contemporary of Jesus, would I have been in any better position than I am now to recognize him as the truth? And he says, no, because he was incognito. He was hidden, right? He doesn't look obviously divine unless you're managing to see him during the transfiguration, but all of those events are very secretive events. So Kierkegaard says, no, it was hidden because it had to be communicated indirectly, because we as human beings cannot fathom, a totally direct communication from God. And also, if God were to directly communicate to us, God were to, reveal God's self in that way, it would totally overwhelm us, meaning we would not be responding freely. We would be responding because we were overwhelmed and because we could think no differently. So, because God loves human beings. God loves creation. God wants creation and humanity to turn back to God, but only in freedom. Because if love is not given freely, then it's not love. If it's not freely reciprocated.
Okay, so
Um,
you've already touched on it, but Kierkegaard has a lot to say about faith. So what's key about his understanding of faith?
okay. So whereas I suppose some thinkers are suggesting that reason is the best way to come to know the truth or to come to understand God. Kierkegaard, like Luther, is suspicious about the limits of reason. It's suspicious about how far reason can go, and thinks that reason can take us so far, but we require grace. Excuse me. So we require revelation. Okay, revelation from God, God to reveal God's self to us in ways that we can understand. But ultimately, faith for Kierkegaard, as in the Lutheran sense, means not simply belief, as in I have followed these arguments to their natural conclusion and I now believe in God, but trust that is based in a relationship, and trust that requires that, leap, if you like. The leap of faith is more of a leap of trust. And faith is something that, in a sense, we will never we will never reach a point where we can do without faith. And that was one of his biggest issues with Hegel, because Hegel, as Kierkegaard saw him, was saying, I have a rational system that explains everything, and as such, belief in Christianity, we base purely on reason. So Hegel claims to have gone beyond faith, which Kierkegaard thought was ludicrous, because we will always be partly in the dark, and as such, it is faith that enables us to, I suppose, is faith that allows us to accept that we are accepted by God.
Okay, that's good. How about Kierkegaard had a lot to say about despair and sin and all that.
Yeah, I should say. I mean, another thing that draws me to Kierkegaard is and my other research interests are tend to be along the darker, more depressing lines. So despair and sin is another thing that interests me about Kierkegaard. But excuse me again. Now, in The Sickness Unto Death, he says that despair is sin. That despair is essentially sin, but by another name. So he's doing something quite clever here. He's retranslating sin into a terminology that would have been more current in 19th century philosophy and even theology. The idea of despair. But also at the same time, despair has always been a theological category. Okay, going back to, Augustine, and obviously Aquinas has lots to say about despair. But in English, as in the Latin, despair means without hope. Etymologically, it means without hope. Whereas in Danish and in German, etymologically, despair means intensified doubt. So to be in despair means to be in a position of doubt, which means that despair and faith are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, you can have faith but still be in a position of doubt over certain things. But ultimately, for Kierkegaard, it is faith that is able to overcome despair. And by despair, he means particular forms of despair that he and the way he writes about despair, you can tell that he knows it. You can tell that he knows it in his own life, perhaps in his father's life. He knows it in the people he's seen around him, in the characters that he's met, whether they're characters in real life or characters in novels and in plays. So he will refer to Shakespearean characters like, Macbeth and Richard III, who seem to embody various forms of despair. And despair for Kierkegaard is tied to this question of becoming a self. So this is really our task, to become the self that we are, destined to be. So in The Sickness Unto Death, he says that there are various forms of despair, and this is where it gets very knotty, unfortunately. There is in despair not to will to be oneself, and in despair to will to be oneself. Okay. Now, what he means by the first one, in despair, not to will to be oneself. So, not to will to be oneself means that you, as a human being, are not willing to become a self, i.e., you are, and he says that this could be people who say that the whole point of life is just pleasure or making money, and I haven't got time to think about those kinds of things, or I'm just going to pretend that these sorts of existential questions don't exist, and I'm just going to hide away from the whole task of becoming person, becoming a kind of fully fleshed human being who knows who they are. Now, so that would suggest that as long as you are trying to become yourself, you're okay. But no, even if you are trying to become yourself, you're probably also in despair. Now, Kierkegaard says despair is more or less universal, in that everyone has been in despair at some point, right? And in many ways, everyone still is in despair in one way or another. So he says, if you decide, okay, I am going to become myself, well, what kind of self is that? Is that the kind of self who puts the ego first and foremost? Is that the sort of person who puts themselves ahead of everybody else? Is that the sort of person who says, I'm going to be the best, and if I'm not the best, then I don't want to play anymore? So he says, there are certain people who say either Caesar or nothing, right? Either I will be the king of the world or I will just be nothing. I'd rather die, right? And of course, he's also talking very much to the romantic audience and the romantic culture. Kierkegaard was very much part of the romanticism um, movement as well, although critical of it. So um, he says that the only authentic self is the self that wills to be itself before God. So in relation to God. He says that whatever we are, whenever we try to become a self, we do so in relation to some other. That other might actually be yourself, that you just kind of talk to yourself and reflects yourself, or it may be another human being. But he says that whoever it is, whether it's you trying to know yourself or you trying to know yourself through other people, there's limits to that. You're always going to get it wrong. Okay. The only way to truly know yourself is to know yourself in the mirror of God, of God's word. Okay. So by standing before God, we become ourselves and we come to know ourselves as we are known by God, i.e., as forgiven, accepted, loved unconditionally. So this means that despair is an important part of everybody's life. And in fact, we have to recognize, he says, we have to recognize that we are in despair. but that if we recognize that we are in despair, we are actually closer to faith. That is one step closer to faith. So he says that God wants us to be, selves, each individual one of us, but that self has to be authentic. And to be authentic, it has to be in relation to God.
Okay, so there's hope. There's hope.
There is.
So, what about Kierkegaard's theology? I mean, his ecclesiology. So, obviously, he had troubles with the church, but I mean, did he continue to attend, or did he just drop out at all? And did he have other fellowship? Or, I mean, people say he's too individualistic. How would you deal with those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. He didn't drop out of going to church entirely. He would go through phases, and in fact, it was in church to nearer to the end of his life, when he saw Regina in church, and she nodded to him as she passed as they passed each other, and he felt that she nodded to him in a particular way, which conveyed that she understood what what he had done, and that she forgave him. So going to church was still, an important part, and he loved, the church itself. The Church of Our Lady in Copenhagen has this wonderful sculpture of Christ at the altar, and it says, underneath on the plinth of the sculpture, it says, "Come unto me." So Christ with his hands out, "Come unto me." But it's only when you get close enough to it, and you get really close when you are taking communion, that you realize that the hands in this Christ sculpture have still bear the wounds of the nails, so reminding us that Christ has suffered for our forgiveness. But at the same time, as I said, he was very critical of the church authorities, and critical because he felt that they were not living up to Christianity. And in fact, it wasn't just that they weren't living up to some first century ideal of Christianity, but that they weren't even living up to Lutheranism, that they had betrayed Luther as well. Now, in a sense, he also thinks that Luther betrayed Luther, but he certainly felt that the Danish Lutheran Church had betrayed Luther's ideal. Luther's ideal for Kierkegaard was this sense that the relationship with God involves a certain degree of angst, and in German the word is Anfechtung, which means a kind of spiritual struggle or spiritual trial. Excuse me, and that relationship of the individual alone before God was vital, but that obviously fellowship was important. And I think Kierkegaard did have people that he was able to have some fellowship with, but I think was probably quite private about that. And I think he's very influenced by the pietistic movement, which emerges in Germany as a sort of revival movement in the maybe I would say the 17th century, 16th or 17th century. And this is where you get a lot of devotional literature, which is concerned that Christianity in Lutheranism, it's a Lutheran movement, but that Lutheranism itself has begun to deviate from Christianity, and we need to return to the true heart of Christianity. But again, the issue was for Kierkegaard, that Christianity was something that he felt hadn't really been tried properly yet. That it's something that we talked about, but decided maybe better not. So this ties in with the whole biblical critical scholarship movement. So he says that the use of historical critical scholarship is a way of trying to keep the Bible at arm's length. So rather than saying, he says, so when you open the Gospels and it says, Christ says, give, sell all that you have and give everything to the poor. And Kierkegaard says, that's quite shocking. Oh my God, could you imagine if someone actually did that? How shocked we'd all be. So instead we say, well, let's analyze the text. Let's try and get underneath what this text trying to say. Let's try and understand the context and the language. And so Kierkegaard says that's a way of defending ourselves against the radical challenge, the radical call of the text. So I think he, aspired to see a church that lived up to the ideals of Christianity. Though, he's not the first person to point that out. I don't think he was too individualistic, but that's partly because I think I'm biased because my own journey has been sadly quite individual, and that's not always been a happy thing. But I've not found Kierkegaard too individualistic because I realize that he's a dialectical thinker, which means that everything always relates to something else, some other kind of opposite. So, because of the danger of the crowd, we have to emphasize the importance of the individual. Okay, because of this danger of being lost and absorbed in something bigger than ourselves, something in which we lose our freedom, we lose our very sense of who we are. Because of that, we need to focus on the individual and address the individual as an individual. But Kierkegaard is never trying to encourage people to just run off on their own and go and live in the woods or whatever. He's encouraging people to take responsibility for who they are. But I don't find that too individualistic. Historically, part of that criticism stems from some misinterpretations of fear and trembling, but that's a scholarly issue that you don't have to get into. And also, I think from a sense of Kierkegaard's, status as the forefather of existentialism and the more individualistic tones that we see there. But ultimately, no, I don't think he was too individualistic because I think he was too dialectical for that. If he had gone too far to one extreme, he would go to another. He saw himself as a kind of corrective, or as more correctly said, a prophetic voice. So the prophetic voice responds to what it needs to respond to, I think.
All righty. And finally, any particularly things you want to share from either of your books on Kierkegaard, particular insights, things you found interesting or important that you haven't said yet?
Oh, blimey. That's very kind of you. I don't, hope to encourage people to, go to read Kierkegaard themselves. But then again, I got a lot from reading other people as well to help me understand Kierkegaard. I think there was only one thing really, which was when I was doing the research for the first book, Kierkegaard and the Self Before God. I realized that by looking at the Danish texts, how much Kierkegaard was talking about this notion of spiritual struggle that referred to before, that in Luther's German is called Anfechtung, but in Kierkegaard's Danish is Anfægtelse, but it's a cognate, it's the same word. And it means a sort of spiritual struggle, spiritual temptation, and realizing just how important that idea was for Kierkegaard, how prevalent it was. So I managed to do a chapter on that in the first book and get a couple of articles out about it. But I wanted to write a book on it, which involved looking also at the Lutheran roots of this idea of struggling with God, and also the pre-Lutheran roots. So it actually brought me back to medieval German mysticism. And that was a real eye-opener because I saw there not just this emphasis upon Anfechtung and spiritual struggle, but I saw there sort of a similar openness to the darker side of things as Kierkegaard himself had, but a sense that of being able to hold these two truths together at the same time. That on the one hand, there is this infinite qualitative difference between us and God, and yet on the other hand, this intimacy, this intimacy between us and God, that is unsurpassed. This, loving union, if you like, to use more mystical language, and that's sort of also brought me into this area that's recently been taken up by a good number of other scholars as well, which is the question of Kierkegaard's mystical elements and the influence of mystical thinking on his thoughts. So that's one of the real current frontiers. So I would encourage people to think about this spiritual struggle, think about Kierkegaard. Well, because it's about thinking about Kierkegaard as a devotional thinker, a devotional theologian, not just a philosophical theologian and not just a philosopher. I mean, it wasn't, that long ago when I started doing my PhD on Kierkegaard, I felt like I was about the only theologian who was working on Kierkegaard. That was a very narrow view that I had and turned out not to be true, but it certainly felt like there was a stronger claim to Kierkegaard from the philosophers, but a lot of philosophical commentators were totally ignoring huge parts of Kierkegaard's authorship. So now there's a much stronger sense of Kierkegaard as theologian, and more theologians working on Kierkegaard, and theologians, who are able to identify things in Kierkegaard that philosophers miss. And I think that says something, actually, if I can just briefly, about the influence that Kierkegaard has had in the 20th and 21st century. I mean, in the 20th century, there's a sense that in his time, Kierkegaard, in his own day, wasn't really discussed very much. Now, there's been some scholarship that has redressed that, and it's not the case that no one cared about Kierkegaard until after he died. That's not true. But in the 20th century, this is when we got scholars, particularly European scholars, and American scholars, who were interested in Kierkegaard, but would think about Kierkegaard philosophically. And it's only really a bit later when you get people like Tillich that they're able to talk about Kierkegaard both philosophically and theologically. But Kierkegaard played a huge role in influencing thinkers like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Richard Niebuhr. And these thinkers, particularly in the case of Barth and Bonhoeffer, these thinkers who played a key role in resisting the emergence of evil in the form of the rise of Nazism. And one of the things that they emphasized was this idea that God is wholly other, meaning that we are not able to take God and weaponize God or turn God or Jesus into whatever we want, right? Whatever image best helps us progress in our agenda. And that's very much what Hitler was trying to do. So Barth and others were speaking out against this. Some of the state German church went along with it for the most part, but Barth and Bonhoeffer and others resisted. And part of that resistance, I like to think a small part of that resistance comes from the fact that they recognized from Kierkegaard and others, but very much from Kierkegaard, and Barth says he gets this very much from Kierkegaard, the infinite qualitative difference, this sense that we are not able to shape God or project God or manipulate the idea or image of God into what we want it to be. So this difference actually protects us, or should protect us, against idolatry. And wherever idolatry takes place, then the prophetic voice needs to come out and speak out against it. So there's a lot of influence there from Barth, and a lot of good scholarship that's been done recently to try and tease that out a bit more. Though, if you ask me, I think that Barth, he read a lot of Kierkegaard, and he may have borrowed more from Kierkegaard than he was willing to admit. That's the more subtle version. I'm not saying he plagiarized Kierkegaard, but I think there's a lot more there. And Barth's not alone in that. I mean, we could talk about Heidegger in the same respect. But yeah. So anyway, so we saw obviously influence of Kierkegaard on post-war thinkers, as well as thinkers during the Second World War, and postmodern thinkers towards the end of the 20th century, and really, I think since the 21st century, as far as I can see, there seems to be, an increasing amount of scholarship on Kierkegaard, and probably more importantly, an increasing number of people interested in Kierkegaard and interested in what Kierkegaard has to say to us today, and what he has to say to us about God and Christ and what it means to be human.
All righty. Well, that's a good place to stop. So I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Simon Podmore discussing the theology of Kierkegaard. So I've got links to his books. Check them out down below. And Dr. Podmore, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you for having me.
All right. Peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.